right, everyone, thank you for coming back or sticking around for this next panel. I'm just going to say the title and pass it over to the presenters. This is Abolitionism and Alternatives to Police and Service Provision Settings, and the presenters will introduce themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us here today. I am Sky Ashton Kantola, and I use she, they pronouns.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. I'm Yeni Bencomo Suarez, and I use she, her, ella pronouns. So, okay, a broader introduction. So I identify absolutely as a radical. I am a Caribbean Latina. My family's from Cuba. I am a community organizer. I'm also very feminist and absolutely an abolitionist. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. But I'm currently now living in Lafayette, Indiana, because I work at Purdue University. Last year, I received a BA in Latin American Latino Studies with a minor in Middle Eastern Islamic Studies from the University of Louisville. And currently, I am the program coordinator at Multicultural Efforts to End Sexual Assault within Purdue University.
I currently do violence prevention, equity, and inclusion work also at Purdue University. I have been involved in violence prevention and intervention work and abolitionism for about 14 years. I helped co-found Indiana Disability Justice in 2018. If you're interested, we have a ton of really cool resources on our website. I will include the link later. I have also been doing pedagogy of the oppressed and theater of the oppressed for several years now, which is basically an engaged form of anti-oppressive education. I am also a white, autistic, and disabled queer, trans, and intersex survivor from Texas. And like I mentioned before, I am bilingual in Finnish and English. It's okay if you've never heard of Finnish. It's like from Finland. And in this photo, you can see a bunch of baby goats chewing on my cane, my keys, and my buttons. So we wanted to start today with a land acknowledgement. Since Yeni and I are based in Indiana, we wanted to provide a land acknowledgement for the state of Indiana. So Indiana is built upon and near the ancestral homelands of many indigenous peoples. We honor and appreciate the Potawatomi, Lenape, Kickapoo, the Mound Builders, Miami, Hinkashaw, Shawnee, and Waya peoples, who are the original indigenous caretakers of the land, and many of whom continue to serve as land caretakers and protectors. I always think it's important in land acknowledgements to recognize that Indigenous people continue to be here and exist. Frequently, land acknowledgements are written in such a way that suggests that Indigenous peoples are not here anymore. And because we're going to be talking about transformative justice and abolitionism, these have been core components of Indigenous pre-colonial and anti-colonial practices. And so we just want to be really deliberate in saying that this framework and this practice is rooted in Indigenous communities. We will have opportunities for discussion. And so we wanted to start out with some community agreements. We want to ask that everyone speak from their own experiences. Everyone is welcome to participate in the ways that you would like. We are going to be very overt in our understanding of abolitionism. And so if you have not been exposed to abolitionism or you are kind of surprised by the language we're using, we just invite you to please keep an open mind. And then say it ugly means we're all learning together. So please say things in the ways that you know how. We don't want a lack of language or a perceived lack of language to prevent us from having these discussions. We also want to note that the photos we have deliberately tried to not use traumatic photos. So we have kind of a mix of calming photos, some of different kinds of protest, but we don't have photos of people being harmed or something like that. And then lastly, we just want to mention that we have a variety of sources throughout this presentation, and not all of them are abolitionist sources, because we want to make sure that we are also giving you the opportunity to see these different perspectives for yourself to make your own informed choices, and also so that you can understand where our critiques of non or anti-abolitionism are coming from. Okay, so this is our plan for today. We have 4 sections. One of them is just a very brief introduction about the origins of policing, prisons, and abolitionism. The second is a quick overview of how queer, trans, and intersex communities have been criminalized. And then an introduction to abolitionism and transformative justice in violence prevention. And then the last section is the actual thinking through abolitionism in service provision and crisis situations. So we're going to start with historical context. We have quite a bit of text on these slides, and that's partly so that if you're, I hope that you're given the PowerPoint after, so you can review some of the information, even if we're not walking you through it, or for folks who maybe couldn't attend the session. So the origins of police, many people probably understand, are rooted in slave patrols. I think it's important to realize that police started not just in slave patrols, but also as a form of cracking down on class struggle and also interracial class organization. However, the police, like early in the 16 and 1700s, were kind of like drunk militias. They were not organized. And so in the early 1800s, whenever there was a larger influx of, I want to note, European immigrants, there was a strong cultural backlash against immigration. And so this was kind of the point at which police organizations start to become more organized and centralized through the government. The first organized police force was established in the mid-1800s in Boston. And I just want to show you in the mid-1800s, this is an actual slave patrol contract. I couldn't figure out exactly where this was located, but it's a real contract. And so on the left, you can see some of the things that are included in this actual like government contract. So it explains that Black folks are not allowed to congregate in public, especially without any kinds of papers or some type of written permission from the plantation owner. And then there was also a lot of policing of enslaved people on the basis of different kinds of Christian holidays. So that's pre-Civil War. After the Civil War, because slave patrols are no longer allowed, this is why the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, is founded. And they are similar to slave patrol militias, except that they are no longer overtly supported by the government. And in the 1870s, the Department of Justice is established. And by the 1880s, almost every major city has a government organized police force, and their entire mandate is to quote unquote keep order. This is important because it's not about serve and protect. It's not really about protecting people generally. It's just to make sure that there is not disturbance against middle class and upper class white landowning people. Something else that's important to understand is during this time, as police forces become organized, and specifically organized by the government, it ultimately means that police are accountable to the same mayors and governors that other businesses and politicians are accountable to. This is still the case currently, and what it does is creates an opportunity for those with the greatest structural power to leverage police forces for their own interests. And on the right, you can see this is actually an abolitionist poster trying to warn people, specifically like enslaved people who have escaped, as well as free Black people, about being aware of the actions and the functions of the police force at the time. So in the early 1900s, this is the first time that what we would now call police reform was attempted. There was specifically an attempt to have localized police who lived in the areas that they were policing. They were specifically asked to walk instead of drive around or be on horses. And the idea was that they would form relationships with the community. Does this sound familiar to anybody? So as soon as this began to be implemented, their prohibition took place in about 1920 is when it started, legally anyway. And when prohibition took place, there was a very aggressive crackdown of these different communities. And the Department of Treasury actually establishes the first, I guess, version of the FBI. Which are called T-men. And this has a lot of parallels to what we have lived through the war on drugs. It basically, this whole system is just intended to terrorize people and maintain the current systems of order. And because of the assassination of a president and this prohibition era, police are eventually established. The FBI is established in the 1930s. And this is a really pivotal moment because people often understand that the FBI has a lot of reach into people's lives domestically. But in terms of police, it also created a centralized, standardized policing system in the US. And I just want to note J. Edgar Hoover had an actual sexual deviance program, which is interesting because we don't know this definitively, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that he was actually gay himself.
Alrighty, so the myth of modern police reform. So policing continues to primarily focus on quote unquote crime control as a means to perpetuate more xenophobia, class warfare, repression of BIPOC, and absolutely repression of social movements. Police reform is honestly the process of whitewashing or laundering the image of police to maintain greater and unaccountable control of communities and as a means to stifle them. And at best, police reform is harm reduction. Police reform is not a preventative measure, nor is it systemic change. Especially when we're funding more money to policing rather than community resources such as housing, community centers, education, and etc. Examples of that are, since 1994, there's been a minimal reactive federal oversight and investigation, and that definitely depends on the current political climate in our country. Community oversight boards, but oftentimes, usually it's the police department that is in control of them. It's kind of like when the police department investigates themselves. De-escalation or diversity, cultural competency trainings. Now, I want to highlight how exhausted these trainings are, and ultimately they have not brought not even reform to police departments, as well as qualified immunity reforms, individualized payouts for victims of police violence, like we saw with George Floyd and the family of Breonna Taylor, changes in police advancement, as well as grievances and report procedures, many of whom, again, is ultimately investigated by the police department themselves. And oftentimes, as another means of quote unquote police reform, there has been, like I said earlier, massive increases in spending on police. And oftentimes, who is being disadvantaged by that? The most vulnerable communities that are actually really in need of investment and in need of resources, not policing. There's also been very much centralized and bureaucratic systems, which makes it even harder to hold the police department accountable. And there's massive surveillance that oftentimes happen in communities, as well as militarized police vehicles and tactics that they use. These tend to be very hierarchical as well. And rather than structural justice ideology and practice, what ends up happening is individualized intervention. And ultimately what happens is that this fuels an even deeper isolation of police from community, very much of quote unquote the thin blue line, us versus them mentality, and very much deep divisions of police based on privileged, allowing them to be supported by those less policed. So that's why, you'll go into a white suburb and folks will be like, well, I don't have those experiences with police. Well, yeah, because you're not the ones being policed. It's Black and brown folks most of the time, and poor people, as well as non-disabled folk who oftentimes say, well, I don't have those experiences. And so what happens is that it makes marginalized communities very much invisible. And that picture, I pulled it from last year when I was still living in Louisville during the racial uprising in protest of the state-sanctioned murder of Breonna Taylor. I was in the streets and there was mass state-sanctioned violence. And honestly, nobody was being quote unquote destructive. However, it's like when you go into a crowd of people, oftentimes you see the police escalates it, right? They'll do all kinds of things. They'll throw tear gas, they'll throw rubber bullets. You'll even have suspicions that cops are dressed in civilian clothing and throwing fireworks in the middle of crowds. And so it's like, it makes people even more tense and it overall escalates the situation. I've never been to a protest and have seen cops de-escalate. It's usually community organizers and everyday people who try to de-escalate. So next slide.
Okay. So a lot of people might have difficulty if you're not familiar with the historical context in more detail about the differences between abolition and police reform. It may be like confusing how to figure out how they differ and why abolition is important and police reform is not helpful. So in public health, there has pretty recently been a lot more research about the harms of spanking children. I'm not saying that spanking and police violence is the same thing. I just want to use this as an example to elucidate the differences. So spanking is similar to modern policing in that it is about compliance and maintaining order. It is not about addressing the root causes of violence, harm, or poverty, or inequity, whatever else we want to analogize. Often, I am someone who grew up in a house with spanking, and I've had opportunities to ask my parents how and why they felt that was effective. Typically the response that I've gotten is, well, my parents did it and I turned out fine. But in my experience, spanking creates fear of people who are supposed to protect you. And it doesn't teach the kid what they did wrong, why it was harmful, or why it was unacceptable in that family. And so from a spanking reform perspective, someone might say, oh, well, let's just let the kid know what will result in spanking. If that's the case, does it make the actual incidence of spanking less harmful somehow when it does happen? I've also heard people say, well, just use it very infrequently or just do it lightly. But does that make it less harmful to the kids psychologically, even if you're not physically assaulting or causing significant damage to the child? I've also heard people say, well, if we just have both parents, we can make sure the parent who's doing the spanking isn't out of line or excessive. But similarly, like in policing, does having body cameras actually make police less violent? And I can tell you from having looked at research on this that most research indicates body cameras have not significantly altered the incidence or severity of police brutality. There's a couple of research that have suggested it might reduce it by 10%. But again, police body cameras were seen as like this perfect solution, and it clearly has not been that. Abolition framework says, why are parents and caregivers incentivized to spank in the first place? So a lot of times it's rooted in maybe a lack of education about childcare, excessive stress from different external factors, or just maybe the parent doesn't know alternatives or that was what they were raised in. So abolition might say, how can we better address the underlying reasons? And also, what are the alternatives? And importantly, what are the intentional and unintentional consequences of those alternatives versus the current status quo?
So police in the present, the surveillance state. So the internet is oftentimes a place where cops will be surveilling. That is increasingly centralized Wi-Fi integrated city infrastructure, including stoplight cameras, license plate readers, and enhanced police vehicle and body cam functions. And so I have experienced this personally, police surveillance, because some organizers and I were planning a protest against Kentucky bills that were trying to restrict abortion access as well as other access things. And so what ended up happening is that we showed up to the protest and the cops were already there before we had even started protesting and marching. So you're going to continue to see cops, again, stifle social movements, stifle protests through drones, as well as biometrics and trying to clock organizers to arrest them. It's pretty serious stuff. So next slide.
So I'm not going to go in depth into the history of prisons, but basically what I want to communicate is in the early 1800s, there was a large debate about whether prisons should be entirely isolated. Oh my gosh, what's the word? Yeah, like in isolation cells where there was just one person per cell, there wasn't room to exercise or go outside, and everyone was expected to stay in complete silence. So that was one model called the Pennsylvania model. And in New York, they created what we basically have today, which is where there was communal living during the day and separation at night. Both cases were, at the time, considered humane, more humane, because before that, prisons were largely places where everyone was cramped. Many people died from sanitation, and typically prisons were simply holding spaces for some type of corporal punishment or death after the fact. Somebody has their hand raised. I clicked allowed to talk. Abena, you're muted if you wanted to say something. Okay.
I did not.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Yeni, you're still muted.
Okay, I was trying to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. So the tenets of carceral culture is I want to emphasize the restrictions of bodily autonomy. And we can see that even from early on when we're in school, we have to ask for permission to use the bathrooms, to when we're grown up and we're trying to access reproductive care, as well as folks trying to access food and water, as well as imposed fear of sexuality. And so that oftentimes hinges safe sexual activity, as well as punishment, retaliation for our actions. And that's oftentimes taught as the only way to hold folks accountable. And also the belief that all laws are moral, which is really wrong, because we live in a country where slavery was legal. And now that has really only shifted into mass incarceration. And that's immoral. It doesn't matter if it's in law, as well as the entanglement of harmful choices with the morality of a person. So the binaries between good people versus bad people, as well as efficiency, productivity, and profit are oftentimes prioritized over the well-beings of our communities and humanity, as well as rules created by those in power rather than those most impacted by the rules, right? Vulnerable, marginalized communities. Those are the folks that are most at the expense of those most impacted by the rules, as well as segregation, right? And I come from a city where it is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. And you see massive disparities between one neighborhood district and another, as well as a lack of transparency and accountability, right? In terms of police departments not being accountable, not being transparent to our local, state, and federal governance. Next slide.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight that I think this slide might be the most important in the entire presentation, because when we talk about abolition, I think a lot of people get really scared of what that means. And ultimately, it means removing these things from our lives so that we can have better things, better lives. Like, instead of saying abolition, if I said, wouldn't it be great if all organizations had an active commitment to transparency and accountability? Most people, unless they were a really toxic leader in an organization, would say, yeah, that would be great. So I'm not going to go through too many examples because Yeni just did, but I do want to just note, for example, in employment, the idea of human resources. When did humans become capitalist resources? That's weird. That seems very dehumanizing. Also, the idea that whenever you have done something wrong at work, instead of any kind of like conversation or opportunity to do better, typically in most organizations or most employers, your boss has just the legal imperative to just write you up, basically. Why do we have to exist that way? Okay, and then Abolitionism is an ideology and practice of eradicating prisons as a theory and cultural norm, as well as in physical form, and including the eradication of punitive systems of accountability or justice. Obviously, abolitionism was started and created by Black folks who were trying to end slavery. This is important because if you look into kind of mainstream resources about abolition, a lot of places will write that abolition started in the 1600s with the Quakers. To me, that's actually saying this is when white people realized abolition was important. Like, white people did not invent abolitionism, and it's very misleading and racist to suggest or reinforce the idea that white people created abolitionism. I also just want to highlight that people often document specific dates or legal categorizations as the end of slavery. For example, Indiana technically entered the US Union as a quote unquote free state, but people who were enslaving other people had the right and obligation to register enslaved people on the census, hence the 3/5 compromise. And so even though Indiana was a free state, there were lots of enslaved people in Indiana. So it's not accurate to rely on legal definitions. I included these two photos of movements for voting rights because, you know what, this is almost 40 years, 50 years later, and we have almost the same signs. Some things have certainly changed, but there is a lot that hasn't. So at the end of each section, we have a bunch of different resources that you can check out. And now I'm going to go through some of the criminalization of LGBTQ communities. So I took some highlights from historical moments that I think we may not realize are the origins of the same things that we're dealing with today. So at the very start of US colonization, Puritan colonists started already documenting Puritan gender norms into the policies of the area. So these were things in legal contracts that you can look up. In the 1800s, there was a whole slew of anti-cross-dressing laws. This was a huge reason that police were able to raid queer spaces or suspected queer spaces and harass, harm, or incarcerate queer and trans folks. Also in the 1880s, there is the first Western publication pathologizing sexuality. And this was called Psychopathia Sexualis. And it argued that queerness was a mental illness that was caused by poor heredity, or basically poor genetics is what we would say now. I'm sure that you can see some of the ways that this has distilled into the modern time, where many people continue to believe that queerness is rooted in something going wrong during gestational development or childhood. Probably many people know of Magnus Hirschfeld, who was kind of the first Western researcher to conduct positive research and meaningful research on gender and sexuality. He was also pretty involved in feminist movements and also tried to combat racist tropes in science and anthropological communities. Of course, he was in the late 1800s and early 1900s, so he definitely also supported some misogyny and racism. But at the time, he was one of the most vocal and most visible proponents of actually treating people with respect. The early or mid 1900s, The Harlem Renaissance creates what is a lot of modern queer culture, including the development of community houses for folks to feel safe in, especially if they ran away or were pushed out by their families of origin. A lot of music and dance, queer music and dance originated here. A lot of people don't necessarily know as much about intersex history, but I just want to note that very early, like over 100 years ago, doctors, as they started trying to apply the perception of the scientific method in biology, doctors decided that it would be best for society if there were just two sexes. And so for the last 100 years, doctors have often been conducting secret and non-consensual surgical corrections on intersex infants. This often happened without the knowledge of the parents, but more recently, typically when this happens, the parents are aware and involved. This has reduced drastically in the last few years, at least in the US, but it still continues to happen. I want to note also that the American Psychological Association, they published the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that kind of lists different kinds of mental health issues. And they have, many people know that the APA historically pathologized queerness. But I just want to note something people may not be as familiar with, which is that at some point they changed from calling queerness a paraphilia, which was like a very extreme sexual disorder. Like we still refer to paraphilias now, but for example, one would be being predatory towards children. So queerness was the equivalent of like pedophilia historically in the medical community. And eventually this switched to sexual orientation disturbance, which basically was a way to say, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with queerness, but many people who are queer are really distressed about their sexuality. So currently we're seeing kind of a similar shift around transness where you, for actually a short period of time, could be diagnosed with gender identity disorder, suggesting that transness was inherently a mental illness. And now we have switched to gender dysphoria, which is specifically around diagnosis for trans folks who feel a lot of dysphoria or are uncomfortable with themselves. But typically this is rooted in the ways that society treats us. And then I just want to remind folks, because I lived through this in Texas, that it was only in 2003 that we federally decriminalized queer sexuality and relationships. Some examples of queer criminalization include different kinds of like gender non-conforming kids being disciplined for being gender non-conforming. Different kinds of dress codes. I know whenever I was looking for a job early in my career, I was repeatedly told by many people that if I wasn't gender conforming, I would never get a job. At some point, I decided I would rather be jobless and homeless than have to not be myself. Although thankfully, that didn't happen. I have a job. You can see different posters or protests on the right from really recent, like post 2010 or 2012 anti-LGBTQ signs. And I just want to note that very similar to lots of different social movements in support of marginalized groups, many of these signs are about protecting women and children. And there are a lot of really similar parallels in terms of race, disability, class. Probably the one that most people will be familiar with is the stereotype that Black men are out to try to be predatory towards white women. So I'm trying to just basically convey that these kinds of stereotypes are often recycled over time with different groups. Okay, so we're gonna move on to, people have a lot of great comments. I haven't read them all, but we're gonna look at transformative justice in prevention work.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I am so excited to present on this. So transformative justice essentially is a political framework that is rooted in community to address harm, abuse, and violence. And this is a daily practice of responding to violence without creating more violence and/or engaging in harm reduction to lessen the violence. So essentially, this is a framework on how to address these things without involving the state. TJ work, which is the abbreviation for transformative justice, originated in Indigenous and Black communities and has been expanded in anarchist and punk communities. And so, like I had said earlier, TJ does not rely on the state because it has an understanding that the state creates more violence, right? Through the form of prisons, police, the justice system, ICE, foster care systems. And so oftentimes, TJ responses don't even rely on incorporating social services like a social worker. TJ does not uphold or perpetuate vigilantism. And so TJ actively works to cultivate accountability, resilience, healing, and safety. And TJ acknowledges the roles of the structural roots and the historic context of violence, whether that is poverty, capitalism, imperialism, insecurity, isolation, heterosexism, and cissexism, ableism, mass incarceration, displacement, war, and xenophobia. And oftentimes the state responses to violence, such as policing, again, generates more violence and oftentimes traumatizes those who are exposed to them, especially marginalized communities who are already being surveilled and targeted and oppressed by the state. And this framework, again, is to be used in communities that cannot call the police because of fear of state-sanctioned violence, deportation, and previous convictions of inaccessibility. Moving on to the next slide. So TJ encourages us to not only address the current violence, but to transform beyond our current conditions to prevent future violence from happening as a means to break intergenerational cycles of violence. It removes state-mediated violence as the only or default method of accountability. TJ reduces risks of incarceration, deportation, and criminalization, and includes accountability, but TJ encourages us all to shift towards holistic justice. TJ creates space for survivors, without isolating those who have caused harm. And so this is a way of engagement in mutual healing. And it replaces intergenerational cycles of violence with cycles of healing. Moving on to the next slide. So this is public health versus transformative justice and violence prevention. So even though state reform is important and useful as a means of harm reduction, TJ focuses on community because we believe there is more possibility for transformation within our communities than the state. And racial justice is at the intersections of interpersonal and state violence. And this states the stage for this kind of examination of mainstream responses to domestic and sexual violence. TJ also in a way calls out quote unquote carceral feminism because carceral feminism relies on law enforcement as a dominant intervention strategy. And this is a way to acknowledge the role that oftentimes white-led anti-violence movements have in a way increased over the decades mass incarceration because they rely too heavily on law enforcement. And this is the ways that, again, the anti-violence movement has increased US investments in criminalization. And as decades of feminist anti-violence collaboration with the carceral state, that has been most associated with institutions of police, prosecution, courts, and the systems of jails, prison, probation, and parole. This also ties into neoliberalism. Whereas the welfare state tries to provide benefits as well as the redistribution of resources to the most marginalized, the carceral state focuses on means of arresting folks, incarcerating folks, surveilling folks, and oftentimes targeting and attacking really the same sectors of the marginalized folks who oftentimes are the recipients of social services. The role of neoliberalism and mass incarceration within the mainstream US context of feminism demands for the criminalization of gender violence. So again, neoliberalism has led to policies of mass incarceration, and it allows for state-mediated violence to remain higher among BIPOC folks, especially queer people of color, women of color, and disabled BIPOC. And it creates a dependency between violence prevention infrastructure and the carceral state. And so this is a quote that I pulled from Carceral Feminism to Transformative Justice, Women of Color Feminism and Alternatives to Incarceration by Mimi E. Kim. The critique giving rise to the term carceral feminism fundamentally centers on the depoliticization of a social movement with politically radical roots. While the anti-violence movement emerged from the civil rights and more radical left movements that were at their force in the 1960s, the timing of the surge giving birth to anti-violence initiatives also coincided with a decline of the precious race-centered movements. So next slide.
Okay. So again, we want to make sure that this is applicable, like practical for everybody. And so we wanted to just give a quick, to explain some of the ways in which transformative justice also can shape our lifestyle choices and our relationships to each other. So I'm only going to focus on a few of these. And the first one is around goals. So whenever we intentionally engage in transformative justice during moments of conflict, our goals are centered around healing and healthy relationships, community wellness, and understanding how our personal relationships also impact the community, and honoring each other's boundaries. Typically during punitive conflict, the focus is on trying to win the argument or to retaliate against somebody else. Another example of this is around the concept of morality. This was something that Yeni mentioned early on, but I think this is incredibly important. I do not refer to people as good people or bad people. I think this contributes to the idea that there are only those who cause harm and those who experience harm, and they are never overlapping. For the most part, like overwhelmingly, I think all people are complex and have both the capacity to support healing and to cause harm. And I think that we need to eradicate this idea of good and bad people from our practice because it doesn't actually address the root causes of harm. And it upholds this idea of perfectionism that none of us can meet and nobody defines. And it prevents us from authentically engaging in conflict and harm in a healing-centered way. So this is continued from the last slide. I'll go through a couple more here. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I forgot one on this one I wanted to go through. So process. I think transformative justice is very process oriented. And so that process needs to actually be created and supported by the people who are most impacted. We can think about employment policy. How frequently do the working class people in an employment situation get to determine any of the policies? It's almost never, even though they're going to be the people who are most impacted by those policies. An example here is that whenever Yeni joined Purdue, we talked about whether or not there is drug testing. And I remember I responded and said, drug testing is only implemented in working class places. In a university with mostly middle class workers who control access to these policies, they do not implement drug testing because there is the perception that higher class people are not going to do substances or otherwise have the problems associated with working class people. Okay, assumptions. Typically in transformative justice-centered conflict, the people intentionally enter the conflict with an assumption that we are here to focus on healing and resolution and have a beginning place, hopefully, of mutual respect. Whereas in punitive conflict, people often come to the conflict with a lack of intention. And so, if you're in a conflict with somebody who has repeatedly caused harm, it's very easy and very natural to be really upset and just want the person to understand how you hurt them and or even maybe to cause harm to have them understand what they did. And so transformative justice requires all of us to also intentionally engage in our own trauma healing and to try to engage in conflict in a way that is invested in each other's healing. The last one I'll go through is the setting boundaries. This goes back to being process oriented. How often, whenever you have worked on a project, have you started by saying, sorry, Yeni's cat is so cute. How frequently have you started a project asking everyone, what do you feel like you can contribute? What do you want to contribute? How are we going to handle it if somebody is not able to do what they set out to do? What kinds of flexible deadlines are we going to have? And so actually being process oriented, setting those boundaries, having flexibility is all really important to both the prevention of harm, but also to engage in respectful and transformative conflict. Sorry, okay.
Hello. Okay, so I always like to include pod mapping. And this is from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. So oftentimes, in my belief, sometimes community can be very romanticized, right? Community is important. Community is vital in a number of ways. However, oftentimes people feel very isolated for a variety of reasons. Whether that's because they're in a DV or SV situation and they're struggling to get out, or for a variety of reasons. So with pod mapping, and you can see here with that worksheet, you create a map of the folks you most confide in, people that consistently show up and are in your life, people that you trust, people that are reliable. when you are experiencing stress, harm, abuse, or violence is happening to you or around you, or if you want to be held accountable because you harmed somebody or you perpetrated some kind of harm. Again, because of the isolation that many vulnerable communities face, including migrant farm workers in Indiana, we can hope that by employing this tool amongst our folk, that we can build and grow pods where people can be safe and happy, and also disrupt the modes of isolation that oftentimes capitalism perpetuates. All right. So abolitionism in service prevention and crises. Sky.
Okay, before I begin, do you need to leave? Because, sorry, Yeni has like a gas leak in her apartment. So if you need to leave and let me finish, that's okay.
That's fine. No, y'all, it's because in all transparency, because we've been talking a lot about transparency, Sky was texting me, slow down. I was like, Sky, I'm having an issue. My neighbor texted me that there was a gas leak going on. However, it's fine. The gas company came. I was just like,
Okay.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Okay, I just don't want you to blow up. It's so scary. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna go through this last section and we'll end with some practice about reimagining abolitionist responses to crises. I want to start by talking about mandated reporting. If you're not familiar with mandated reporting, it's basically a set of laws that determine what kinds of harm are obligated to be reported to different kinds of government-supported entities. So, for example, any kind of suspected or actual child abuse or neglect is required to be reported to some kind of authority. And that's across the US. But there's also different kinds of mandated reporting in different settings. For example, college campuses often have different regulations because of Title IX, which is the legislation that requires sexual violence prevention to take place on college campuses. So in thinking through a more abolitionist framework for mandated reporting, it's really important to start out knowing what your mandated reporting responsibilities are. And sorry, let me re-clarify that with child abuse, that's true for any adult. Even if you're not in a service provision setting, the federal law requires that you tell somebody who has the ability to intervene. And it's important to understand mandated reporting does not say you have to respond by reporting to police. So if you suspect child abuse, you need to maybe tell Child Protective Services or somebody else in your area who can intervene. You're not required to submit a report to police. It's also really important to talk about mandated reporting early and often. Especially with young people. As somebody who once was mandated reported, I was so horrified because not having any control about what was happening to me to be discussed with other people was actually more traumatic than whatever I was experiencing at home. I almost passed out whenever I had to talk to the person who I was reported to. And I was so scared that I refused to talk to them. And so I continued to live in the situation I was in because I was too scared of the state. We wanted to provide you a couple of scripts or examples about how you might talk about mandated reporting. And I'm just going to read the one for children, young people, or basically, this is an example that is trying to prioritize cognitive accessibility. So here's an example. It says, I've noticed you're having a hard time. I want to ask if you're okay. First, I want to explain that if someone is hurting you or you're hurting yourself, I may need to tell a specific person. The specificity is important because if you, especially for like a kid, if you tell them I have to tell somebody, that sounds scary and unknowable. So I need to tell the school counselor. I need to talk to the people at the community center, something like that. Be specific. It's okay for you to tell me anything. I won't be upset or mad at you. I just want to make sure you know what you can tell me that I can't tell anyone else. For example, if someone's dad was hitting them, I would need to tell, again, the specific person so that they could help them too. Does this make sense? Do you have any questions about what I have to tell other people? So this gives the agency to the person to be able to decide how they talk about whatever's happening with them.
I'm good now, y'all. That's sewage gas. Yikes. Okay, abolition and service provision and eligibility. So how to be an abolitionist when you're dealing or working within service provisions is to eliminate drug testing and to work to eliminate extremely low income caps, especially for people, for disabled folks, as well as the length of unhoused status. Like, it is insane to me as someone who has worked to organize funds and housing for unhoused folks that a lot of agencies say you have to wait a year until we can house you. Like, what the hell? This person's unhoused now. It's winter time. It's getting close to that. As well as gender assigned at birth, as well as immigration status. So as also someone who has accompanied a lot of refugees, undocumented folks, and has tried to get services and resources for undocumented folks, it is extremely frustrating when refugee agencies, for example, say, hey, we know that a border crisis is happening right now. Let us know how we can be in solidarity with Central American folks. And then you say to them, hey, they're undocumented, or hey, they were not paroled at the border. Then they say, oh, we can't help. And it's like, but you have an array of resources that regardless, this person needs, as well as language access, making sure that people have accessibility to a language that they understand, cognitive accessibility, ASL, and removing obstacles and barriers for people who have felonies. And oftentimes what we see in service practices that are very punitive is uncoordinated and segregated statuses across agencies, and revoking services or temporary services that do not end according to clients' needs. So if someone is misusing substances, for example, and someone revokes services from them, it does not matter what that person is doing or has done. That person's a human being and should be and is entitled to all of their basic needs and all of their human rights. Moving on to the next slide in terms of intake. So intake, think to yourself, is each question necessary? Are these questions trauma informed? Are they suicide safe? Is the language that you're employing accessible to everyday people? Do the intakes include accessible guidance on how to navigate agency policies regarding the relationship to police and prisons, as well as what Sky was talking about earlier, mandated reportings? Does your service provisions include commitments and practices to anti-oppressive policies, including anti-racism, LGBTQIA inclusive, as well as disability justice, as well as making sure that family arrangements, shelters, restrooms are inclusive towards all genders, as well as do people have options for choices. Regarding crisis calls, I want to highlight this. I understand that there is an initiative that is part of police reforms that we should incorporate social workers to work for police departments. I know that's an initiative here in West Lafayette, Indiana, the same town where Purdue's campus is housed. That is not the solution, because if someone's going through a mental health crisis and a social worker comes with a cop, that does not guarantee that whatever the person discloses is not going to be shared with the cops or in the court system. And cops should not be involved at all in mental health emergency calls. The police officers are not equipped to do that kind of work, and they should not be used as a default option, because people should get to make their own choices for police involvement, especially if they're going through a mental health crisis. And as someone who has experienced a multitude of mental health crises, I would never want to have the cops show up. I want my mom. Like, you know what I mean? Ask me who I want. I want my mom to come. Like, you know what I mean? That's who I want. I don't want to see any cops. And if the cops do get involved, do you have a practice in place for facilitating those interactions? And that is something that, as an organizer, I thought it was important to include, because whenever there's a protest or a march that's being organized, we always have a police liaison. Oftentimes that is a white person that can better navigate the system and engage with the cops, so the rest of us don't have to, because I don't want to. Jasmine, okay.
Jasmine, I allowed you to talk if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know what was happening.
Mhm.
So I understand that you stated you have a multitude of experience with, I guess, crisis interventions regarding mental health, and that you don't like to get the police involved, et cetera, et cetera. So for instances where the person is physically, I guess having a physical episode of some sort, which could potentially put the social worker in harm's way, I'm trying to understand what solutions you have in place other than therapeutic holds, which are also deemed unsuccessful, to not get police officers involved. Because although we want the client to feel safe and we want them to feel like they're in a position to talk and be open, we have to consider our safety as well. So I'm wondering what things you have in place for not being a part of your systematic process.
So I always like to bring someone with me who has a variety of skill sets in de-escalation and ways of handling that situation. That's always what I've done. And when I was saying a multitude of mental health crises, I was also including myself. I've been in situations where folks have threatened to call the police, and I have said, do not call the police. Like, that's not what's going to help me in this situation. So that's how I usually handle it, is that I always have people that are close to that person as well. And when I'm handling those situations, I've always come as a community member, as someone who knows that person. And that's how I always handle that situation. I don't like to bring random people that person does not know. Sky, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I guess first off, that part of the point of this discussion is acknowledging that we haven't built the infrastructure to do this all the time. So I understand that there are some times where police will be involved, or you feel like there are no other answers. I would also say that part of what we're also trying to suggest, and we actually have a slide on this, which is that there has to be community infrastructure since there isn't state infrastructure. And so hopefully and ideally, you can create local communities of care that are prepared to intervene in these situations. I also understand that particularly if someone, for example, is experiencing psychosis or is having a difficult time, what I refer to as, I will sometimes say, I experience differences between individual and collective reality. So if someone is experiencing psychosis or something else, like they may be less able to connect to collective reality. And I think that's also why we need more people who are neurodivergent and experience different kinds of mental illness in this field, because I've often found whenever social workers or even police are scared of or unsure how to respond to people with certain mental illnesses, it's partly because there is a significant gap in experiential knowledge. So I completely understand sometimes, like, no matter what you do, like, you might feel like you're in danger. And I can understand why, as a last resort, you might feel the need to call the cops because we don't have that infrastructure. And I also think that there are lots of ways, like creating communities, having more understanding around the experiences of mental illness, that we can reduce the amount of reliance on police. Does that help answer your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, for the most part, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to add that abolition is a lifetime effort. Like, we're not saying that we are going to take away cops and prisons overnight, but it's to build the community infrastructure. So when I have found myself in those situations in which I'm trying to help someone deal with their mental health crises, it's always been in a community setting. So I don't know if some of y'all have heard of Mariam Kaba. She is an abolitionist, and we've actually put some of the books that she has written into the resource thing for our transformative justice. She has said that she only intervenes and she only does accountability processes in the community that she belongs to. Otherwise, she is an educator and a facilitator of teaching all kinds of folks about abolitionism and transformative justice. And so, to give more context, that has always been my role and my function in addressing these. So moving on.
I just want to add one thing about this slide. So there's a bullet point that says police should never be the default option, but it's important to give people all of the options available to them. You know, sometimes people just don't know what their options are. And so I think one role of a community organizer or an advocate can be to actually just give people the options that are available to them that they may not be aware of. And so I have also served as an advocate whenever people want to use the police. I've had a lot of mixed experiences with that, but I never want to tell people that they can't utilize the police if that's what their choice is.
Yeah. And for me, I've oftentimes have worked with people that literally cannot call the police because they're undocumented. And more times than not, ICE gets involved and it hurts them more than actually, helps out the situation. I've also, like Sky has said, if someone wants to use the police, they've come. But unfortunately, in the experiences where I've been present, the cops refuse to write the report for the sexual assault, or they're just incredibly not helpful and not equipped to handle those kinds of situations. So moving towards transformative justice and services, what kind of, like what we were saying, community infrastructure can we create to support more safety, sustainability, care, and connection? So something that I really loved when I was in Louisville in the height of the protest is that there was a group of therapists and social workers that came together and created a collective called Therapists for Protesters Wellness. And so I thought that was amazing because so many people that were involved in the protest and involved in organizing did not have access to a therapist. They could not afford it, or they didn't have the healthcare to cover that. And so just to, have some kind of like abolitionist framework of addressing mental health needs was so amazing to watch, and they have continued to do that work, and they have continued to be available for people who need mental health services ASAP. And so I guess the key of the message as well is, how can you make your services accessible to all people? I know that we're short on time, so I want to just say two more things. What are some of the harmful ways that we treat each other that help set the stage for violence and abuse, and how can we change that? So that is in all settings, including interpersonal. And the way that we treat each other as colleagues impacts the way that we conduct violence prevention in the field.
Yeah, I just want to add, when I kind of shifted from being an unpaid community organizer to a paid violence prevention specialist, I was so shocked at how harmful people in this field are to each other. I don't expect people to not cause harm like we've talked about, but I just want people to be willing to work through it and discuss it, even when it's really difficult. I guess I just want to mention that I think the ways that we work together and our ability to be accountable in our personal lives also impacts the impacts we have on others and our ability to be engaged in violence prevention in a meaningful way. Okay, I think this is our almost last slide before the practice. So, like we mentioned before, transformative justice is not a scalable practice. It needs to be rooted in your own local community. So these are just some general guidelines that you can use as you're trying to learn how to do this and experiment and be creative. So when we talk about violence prevention, we also want to think about prevention in terms of accountability. So in your local community, you can have survivors come together and brainstorm, what did people need before, during, and after a crisis? How can you kind of lay a general foundation for what that process might look like? This can be especially important in terms of timing, right? Like, I've facilitated transformative accountability processes in a conference where we have a very limited time and space to do the process, but in community spaces, we might have a lot longer time. And so kind of the action plan will help you decide, like, in different spaces and contexts, what might this look like and how can you be prepared to show up for survivors? Yeni has mentioned, like, it requires kind of a cohort of folks who are willing to actually do this together. And then during the actual crisis, I think we actually talk about this in violence prevention, which is that we obviously want to prioritize the immediate safety and comfort as much as possible of the person who experienced harm. Also, if you're familiar with trauma-informed practice, or if you've experienced some kind of crisis yourself, you're probably aware that whenever something really stressful happens, it's really hard to make choices or even know what your choices are. And so part of your plan can be, these are the potential choices depending on the situation. And it's not that that has to be an exhaustive list, but just kind of a brief, discrete, like, specific list of items that that person may need so they can make a choice without having to come up with all the options themselves. Facilitating trauma release. So where I live is actually at a really busy intersection that has a lot of wrecks. And I always kind of joke with my partner that the universe put me here because I'm a trauma worker. So anytime a wreck happens, I actually go outside and I look for the vehicle or the person who has the most severe parts of the wreck. And I actually talk them through their trauma response. And I think, like, if the car is not smoking and smells okay, I want them to stay in the car. And I'll talk with them about different things potentially unrelated to the wreck so that they're not so panicked about that. Usually positive things like, how are your kids? Stuff like that. And then as they start to kind of acclimate to what happened to them, I will tell them, hey, I know right now you're probably going to focus on little details. That's okay. Whenever you get out of your car, your body's probably going to be shaking a little bit. So you want to kind of lean on the car and kind of get your bearings before you try to walk away, if they're well enough to leave. And I always stay for however long the police are there, because I often find police are profoundly unhelpful whenever people are experiencing some kind of severe trauma. In the same way, you can kind of, if you educate yourself about trauma-informed practice, you can walk survivors through that so that they feel supported and safe as they integrate. And then after the crisis, this is where kind of the longer term process will begin, where we figure out, once that person is no longer in survival mode, what do they need to be supported by the community? What do they need of the person who caused harm? How do they want to be involved in the process? Those kinds of questions. Yeni, is it okay if we skip this so we can get to the...
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Okay. Okay. Before we do this, I just want to see if anybody else has any other questions that you wanted to discuss before we do a practice. I know this was like a lot of information, and I'm honestly impressed that we finished this far on time.
For real though.
Okay. All right, we can do this. So we have 3 practice options, and I'm gonna read the first one, and then we're gonna go through the questions at the end to see what ideas people have, and you're welcome to just put those in the chat if you would like. And if you already have ideas for the first option, you don't have to wait for us to finish reading. Okay, so this first example is related to a more abolitionist response to mandated reporting. The scenario says, you are co-leading a queer and trans youth group with kids between the ages of 13 and 18. Aspen is a 14-year-old trans femme kid who is currently only out to her mom, while her dad believes his child is attending therapy during youth group. Aspen is a first-generation American, and her parents emigrated from Vietnam before she was born. Even though most of her family still lives in Vietnam, her family has a close-knit community of Vietnamese immigrants around Seattle, Washington. Aspen usually arrives at group early so she can change into clothes she's more comfortable in. Aspen is an active member of the group and is often one of the group members who is most attentive to others' emotional needs. One day, Aspen comes to the group and doesn't change into her other clothes, and she is much quieter than usual. You ask how she's doing, and she tells you she's okay, just tired, but you notice that she seems to be moving around as if she's in pain. She also has some bruises on her arms and near her neck. So what are some of the safety issues that you notice both physically and emotionally for her? And I'll read out responses as people type them. someone may have physically hurt her, maybe a family member. What else? Concern for physical abuse and physical safety. My immediate concern with bruising around the neck is strangulation and a high risk of lethality associated with strangulation. Yeah. I think another thing that I would also, obviously, yes, I agree, the strangulation is probably the most immediate concern. I would also be kind of worried about this kid not being out to her dad. Yeah, people say emotional abuse or reluctance to share because of the family. Yeah, so it is particularly possible statistically that the person who's causing her harm is in the immediate family. Because we're not really sure why the abuse is happening, it could be unrelated to her being out. It could be related to her identity. It also could be self-inflicted potentially, especially if she's having a lot of pressure around performing around her dad. Okay, so what are some of the possible next steps given what you do and don't know about this particular young person? And I just want to remind folks, since this is a kid, you're obligated to report to someone who can intervene. Also, honestly, there's not really right or wrong answers. This is really just an exercise in brainstorming, like trying to work through what the potential ramifications of different choices might be. Okay, we are at time, so we'll wrap up after this one. Talk with her up front about mandated reporting. Report, ask if they want to talk, reach out to their parent who is supportive. To talk with them and safety plan, start with open-ended questions, take her aside to ask if she needed support and crisis plan. Yeah, these are all great ideas. Yeah, I think it is very helpful to start with the kid to see if she's willing to talk about what's going on. And I think it is important to talk about mandated reporting up front. However, I will note that in this situation, because there is a strong suspicion of abuse, even if the kid doesn't want you to report, the law says that you would have to. When I'm in situations around mandated reporting, sometimes what I've done is I explain to the person that I have to tell somebody and who I have to tell. And I will give them the option, do they want to go with me or do they want me to do it alone? And helping make sure that they fully understand what that process is going to look like. Obviously, since this is a minor, the parents will likely be informed of the report unless that parent is known to be an abuser, in which case they will be notified, but the process will look different to keep the kids safe. And I forgot the last thing I was going to say, but Yeni, do you have other thoughts about this scenario you wanted to share?
Yeah, I agree. I believe that in this situation, you're going to need to report it. However, like, you can still honor the agency and the autonomy of this person and just like guiding them as to, do you want me to accompany you? should I go alone? And explaining them what the rest of the process is going to look like.
Yeah, I remember too, the last thing I was going to mention is in this situation, you don't necessarily know if the mom is actually involved in the abuse. And so that's another reason it's really important to try to talk to the kid, because you might get a better idea of where this harm is coming from, especially whether it's one of the parents, if it's another family member, or some kind of self-harm. You want to try to get as much context as possible before talking with a parent. I would also note if in this situation you want to talk to the mom, it might be really helpful to actually talk to the mom whenever she arrives or leaves the group, since this will be a time whenever the dad is not there, since it seems more likely that the mom is being more supportive. Okay, we're at time, so I just want to briefly show you the other two scenarios, and then we will close out. So this is an intimate partner violence scenario where a couple have moved to a new area, and an abusive partner is isolating their other partner from other kinds of support, and they're both adults. And this last scenario is focused on violence within a community organizing scenario. So you will have these slides, like Scott said, so you're welcome to continue brainstorming, even hopefully like within your local communities, about how you might respond. And thank you so much for giving us flexibility to wrap that up. And I appreciate everybody's participation today.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you for being open to maybe ideas you haven't heard of before or are not as familiar with. So I really appreciate everyone today. So thank you.